Welcome back to the Speaker's Corner show. My name is Heiko Khoo. This is the first show on the 6th of May 2020 for a few months. A few months ago I suspended the show just before, well, it was about January time, and we agreed that we would restart again on the 6th of May. I, of course, was not at that time fully aware of what was about to happen in the world. And so I have actually been monitoring quite carefully. I sort of took time out to monitor quite carefully what's been happening in the world around the whole issue of COVID-19, the world economic crash, and associated phenomena. So that's the beef for what you're going to get today. And during the next period, I'm likely to be covering themes associated with the COVID-19 and global economic and social crisis. So a little bit for those who don't know about the show, Speaker's Corner show is nearly always recorded at Speaker's Corner. I've been going to Speaker's Corner, that's in Hyde Park, Marble Arch, since 1986, the December of 1986. And I've been speaking pretty much on and off every week since that time. For those of you who are checking on the website, speakerscorner.net, you'll be able to see the video of this radio show. And I'll try and give you some glimpses. Well, firstly today, just about Speaker's Corner. You can see it's pretty damned empty today. And also perhaps around London, and do interviews with people around the world and so on. We've entered a new phase also of human intercommunication. All the type of ideas of the internet obsessives, or internet, net files you might call them, the people who in the 1990s and the early 2000s were imagining the future of the internet as a utopian and a dystopian one. Well, all those ideas have come to fruition. There are, of course, a lot of people who are worried about what the dynamics are in relation to the internet, surveillance state, integrated together with observation, integrated together with facial recognition, integrated together with medical records. There's talk about the vaccination campaigns and chipping people up and all this sort of thing, which has led to a huge proliferation of conspiracy theories, which I've always been... How you doing, all right? That's Steve Barnes. Steve, you got a minute? That's Steve Barnes, the police officer from the area. I'm back on the radio again today, so I'm trying to do a sort of just one straight cut of 30 minutes about the world today, and I'm sure you've got something to say about that. How do you think it's affected the park and your life?
First couple of weeks, very difficult.
Yeah.
Very strange times for the public, and definitely for us, because we're given legislation and situations, and we're sort of scratching our heads how we deal with this, because the question mark over public consent and everything, people sort of challenging it. Is this a police state?
You didn't have any trouble here, though, did you, with anybody?
There's always one or two.
Yeah, but it's a little thing.
But now everybody's just generally settled down, and both sides are policing us, and there's a bit of an equilibrium. However, people are getting itchy feet now. They want to get back to some kind of normality.
For sure.
Whatever that's going to be.
For sure. And in the police, amongst your lot, did some of you come down with it, or?
Yeah, we've had one fatality in
really?
the Met, one BTP
in the Met,
that I know of, and there's 3 or 4 that have had tested positive that had it as well.
Is that right? Yeah.
I think I had it back in January. But I don't know.
Lots of people are saying that, but it seems to be too early a date for their calculations,
exactly.
Isn't it? Yeah.
But personally, when my daughter works, she works in a care home, and they lost 16 in 3 weeks.
All right, yeah.
So,
I mean, it seems to have been that a lot of the cases were cases that were imported effectively into the hospitals, and then they couldn't get rid of it. It's like, unless you test everybody at once, somebody's bringing it in, somebody's affected someone else. So, that's the horrible thing, isn't it? So, actually, one of the worst places to go was hospital, wasn't it? In the early weeks, it was like, for some people, a death sentence, wasn't it? Yeah.
But yeah, it's real strange time, didn't he? You wake up and you think, oh dear, this is a different world we're living in at the moment.
Oh, that's right. No, I was just talking about that, the tech side of it. The way they've changed the universities. For example, my son's entirely now at university on the internet.
Yeah.
It's an alienating way of doing things, but I mean, in a way, there are some benefits worldwide in theory, but
it
here...
is, and you're right, and it's... I mean, I've always had this kind of bit of a mantra that social media and that kind of thing is really the cancer of freedom of speech. And we've had a society that's grown over like 5 years. More and more people have been isolated from being one-to-one, getting together like doing Speaker's Corner.
Yeah.
And now we've seen what's happened. There's COVID, and everybody's got an angst about social distancing. That's another wedge again of actually getting people together too.
No, that's right.
Getting around and
That's
talking
right.
together.
The strangest phenomena, I must say, phenomena. And now they're talking about this sort of indefinite... I think this is nonsense, to be honest with you. How can you indefinitely maintain people at some social distance, blah, blah, blah? It's just nonsensical as far as I'm concerned.
It's in human nature to gather. But, I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, that's the argument, isn't it? You see, the Chinese, they just bang, one go, dealt with it. New Zealand as well. I mean, New Zealand started later. It started earlier. But in a way, it's better just to solitary confinement for 3 weeks and it's over, rather than just drag it on and on and on and on and on, isn't it? That's what at the moment it's almost like there's no escape, Yeah.
Oh, well, it is what it is, and we are where we are.
Yeah. I'll give you a ring about the Speaker's Corner prospects for the future in a while, but we won't talk about that now, yeah?
Keep well.
I'll give you a buzz, yeah? See you later, man. Ta-ra. So, he's Steve Barnes. Steve Barnes has been very helpful over the last 2 years or so with Speaker's Corner. Now, in the past, we've often had a sort of semi-hostile relationship with the park authorities, and Steve is keen on Speaker's Corner. He met up with a lot of the people, regulars at Speaker's Corner, particularly when there was a lot of conflict going on a few years ago with some far-right activists coming down here and trying to provoke conflicts between people with conflicts with the Muslims. That's the truth of the matter. They wanted to create some sort of... there was a guy called Tan, for example. He threw a Bible on the floor. Sorry, not a Bible. He threw a Quran on the floor in front of the Muslims. Then he tried to harass Muslims who were praying, and he kept insulting them and so on. And then there was the Tommy Robinson affair, where Tommy Robinson came down here. There's a lot of conflict with various Muslim groups, and they also tried to stopped me from speaking at the time and pulled me off my platform several times and so on. And Steve had an attitude, well, we should get together the people at Speaker's Corner and try and work out some modus vivendi where we can have different points of view, even insulting points of view, expressed at Speaker's Corner, because otherwise what are you going to do? Constantly repress people. You can't say that, you can't say that. Actually, one of the peculiar phenomena in the last weeks has been this whole story about fake news. Now, on the one side, there's the government attempting to get their message across, which is an understandable idea. You try and get, you work out what you think the problems are, and then you try to express your message as a unified opinion to try and get everyone to behave in a certain way. That's the behavioural science, so-called, behind the present government's campaigns. And the problem with it is that as soon as there's nuance to it, so in other words, as soon as people can question the details of what is being said by the government, for example, the mask question, as soon as you question that and you understand that there's something wrong with the argument, then of course the whole structure of the government's argument falls apart. Now, that of course is what happened quite early on. Well, not early on, this is what happened in March, is that the government's narrative about things will be fine, you just got to have a little bit of distance and take a little bit of care and wash your hands. That argument collapsed because there were increasing numbers of deaths, increasing numbers of infections, and the scenario became inevitable that Britain wouldn't be able to cope and would have many thousands of deaths. And as a result of that, the government changed its tack it was on the 23rd of March that they introduced the lockdown at Speaker's Corner. On the 8th or 9th of March, I'd been arguing strongly in favour of lockdown and had people harassing me, shouting at me, screaming at me, telling me I'm a maniac and how am I believing all this rubbish and so on. Now, of course, the government has had this extremely confused projection of information to the population, and the consequence of that is a general scepticism, combined together with the facts that it's known that the government was misleading the people about the extent of the dangers here, misleading the people about the equipment they had provided, misleading the people about their arrangements with separate parties, like, for example, with the supermarkets and so on. Not purchasing sufficient equipment to ensure that the healthcare workers are safe and so on. And the consequence of that is that the public became extremely sceptical of these messages. Second thing is the messages, I don't know how they do it, there's some sort of legislative framework I'm sure they use, to push the mass media and journalists, not that it need pushing, but to push them to toe effectively a government line. So rather than seriously investigate and question and challenge the existing rulers and the information they're giving out, there is a placid, subservient attitude on the part of the media, which feeds into a subterranean consciousness that we're being lied to. And that, of course, is why the theories of people like David Icke and the 5G conspiracists, who effectively they're arguing that the microwave radiation spectrum that is used by 5G is dangerous to the human body, and that this has undermined the immune system of people. Some are arguing that this helped to facilitate the spread of the virus in Wuhan, and others are arguing that it's a general health concern and 5G is about preparing the world for a dystopian totalitarian state. And of course the lockdown, or lockdowns all around the world, don't forget, feed into this narrative, this general narrative that there is an intergovernmental conspiracy by various organisations like World Health Organization, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and so on, to take over the running of the world effectively through technology, through apps, through high-speed communication linked to 5G. So 5G allows you to instantaneously, so say on this lamppost here, you've got a 5G transmitter or booster, then you could have an autonomous object, a drone, a vehicle, something like that, controlled in real time. So why is that important? Because, for example, if you want to carry out microsurgery on someone in Somalia when you are a doctor or surgeon in London, you would have to know that that microsurgery is being carried out in real time as you act on your sensor-related hand instruments and so on. And so this is effectively what it is. It's a sort of world, what they call the Internet of Things, that 5G will facilitate the use of real-time machinery, objects that surround us in our everyday lives, that are like Alexa and this sort of rubbish, and that they reorganize the world. Some people would say for convenience, and I'm sure it's always so, the smart meters in your home and all this sort of thing. And others will say for totalitarian control. And certainly people like Ed Snowden and so on have quite correctly pointed out the tyrannical potential of the legislative framework that has been passed in many countries, not only those accused of being dictatorships, during this period of COVID-19 and the international pandemic. Now, I'm going to approach the question a slightly different way, and that is because I'll deal less with the specifics of the disease, although I'll come back to a couple of aspects of that later on. But everybody who knows me and those of you who don't, well, I've been a Marxist since I was 17 years of age, and I've been monitoring and following world affairs, specialization in what are called communist countries, or what were called communist countries, since really my early 20s. And what I can say is that this is the biggest crisis of capitalism in my lifetime, and probably in the lifetime of anyone around the world. And by the crisis of capitalism, it seems a bit weird, it's like a religious person might walk down the street and say, it's the coming of God. Or a Muslim might say, Allah is upset with the way in which people have behaved. Or a green obsessive might turn around and say, well, it's nature biting back against the misuse by man of nature. Some might say it's the animals getting their own back. Here's a dog over here, getting their own back at man for mistreating them and eating them and so on. So I guess everyone will come with their own perspective, and you might say, well, all perspectives are equal. Well, obviously you might say that if you're someone who doesn't have a perspective of your own, or a very clear perspective of your own, other than the generality that everyone's view is equal. But from my own point of view, I try and justify it and explain it and allow you to decide whether you think it's right. And there are a lot of people who do think it's right, and a lot of people, even amongst the establishment, who think it's right. And then a lot of people who think it's nonsense, man is basically bad and man is evil and so on. So from my point of view, the key thing to understand is that the socio-economic system of capitalism is a system whereby investment, the monetary accumulation of wealth in the world, is driven by the private interests of capital owners, and capital owners invest for profits. And the investment for profit is a competitive investment to gain a dominant position within markets. And the maximization of profit is the driving force of capitalism. So where there's a higher profit in, red buses driving around London than in running cafes like the cafe over here, the money will tend to flow towards the red buses. If Bitcoin becomes, the source of gaining money, then people will pour their money into Bitcoin. If it's the yen in Japan that people believe that there's a higher profit from, then they'll put their money into the yen. If it's road sweeping activities, then they'll put their money to road sweeping. If it's prostitution, they'll put their money in prostitution. Capitalism is a system that pursues investment for maximization of profits. Now, once you understand that external totality governing the dynamics of the way in which mankind lives in most of the planet, then you have to understand the role of government as, if you like, an enabler for that, but it doesn't generally dominate that. So government is seen as an enabler for private enterprise. And for example, you can see the evidence for that in the government programs to overcome the economic consequences of COVID-19, of SARS-2. And so if you look at the proposals by the government and the suggestions of the government, it's business-centric. So in other words, it's focused on ensuring the continuance of the economic activity of private capitalism. So in other words, commodity production for profit, maximization of investment, maximization of profit from investment. Now, the consequence of that is around 2/3 of all the money that the government has allocated is going towards the private sector. And the rest of it is sort of social defence and so on, the furloughing of staff and so on. About 6 million people now furloughed, 2 million on universal credit. In the United States, more than 30 million people been made unemployed. And when you look around you and think of where we're going to be going it seems to me quite clear that the big will consume the small. The big sharks will consume the small fish. You know, the small shopkeeper, the small restaurant, the small bookshop, the small enterprise doesn't have the capital resources to be able to last for months and months and months, or years and years and years, without sufficient revenue. And for example, the business that I work for is the Karl Marx walking tour, plug, and we haven't had any customers. We've shut down 3 weeks before, or 2 weeks before the government proposed the shutdown. We closed our tours, aware of what was happening in China and expecting that this would last for a couple of months, but actually it's now seems to be dragging on, and the prospects for changing things that allow us to run our walking tours is still a little bit distant. So I want to touch on, so the argument I'm making is that capitalism is the cause of this crisis. It's not the cause of the specific disease, but it's the cause of the crisis in the sense that capitalism can be, on occasion, like a house of cards. You have the intervention of government to try and, for example, to provide a health service, but the health service is a not-for-profit institution. It's based on need. So how much resources do you throw in there? My uncle used to say, the healthcare service, it's a bottomless pit. You can always spend more money on health, which is perfectly true. And so those people who run the institutions within the public sector health service, which is predominantly still public sector dominated, they seek their self-expansion and improvement. So that's one pressure and tendency. Exists with the army, exists with the police, exists within the judiciary, exists within any public sector institution, universities, schools, hospitals. But on the other side, the private sector, where it dominates the general interest within society, the private sector will pressure to release this burden, non-profit making burden on the economy that holds back the potential for the private sector to grasp the resources and dynamically use them effectively for their profit, and as a consequence, of course, under the capitalist theory, the profit and benefit of all mankind. This dynamic is in contradiction with each other. So health, life, welfare, the benefits of the people, prosperity for the people, innovation for the people, education for the people, rather than for private profit, are all in direct contradiction with the social system that we live under. And it is that contradiction that came to a head, and it's probably not an accident that it came to a head, worst of all, in Britain and the United States of America. Because these are the two champions of free market, what in recent times people called neoliberalism. Now, I don't know how many of you have seen this bizarre speech by Boris Johnson, which he made on the 2nd of February 2020. And it was his keynote speech addressing the future of Britain after Brexit, the 31st of January. And in this speech, Boris Johnson was praising free markets around the world and free exchange around the world based on a theory of what's called competitive advantage. So in other words, you've got a lot of workers, give them low wages, some investment with low capital intensity. So for example, textile industry is typical industry for low wage economy. For high population, low capital intensity, textile industry is great. So it's about, arranging according to your various capital labor relationship proportions. So this is the theory, it's called competitive advantage. It comes from a guy called Ricardo. He's a economist, Scottish economist. Anyway, Boris Johnson turned around and he says, when people say that coronavirus will require restrictions and so on, we will say no. We'll be like Superman, Clark Kent, jump into a phone box and save the world. One country will do this and Britain will be the one. So this told us the tensions within society between government intervention to protect health and government intervention to protect the private sector and to protect the freedom of exchange, as he said. And the consequences are here for us to see. Britain has the highest death toll in the whole of Europe, and it's been disgusting to look at the news in Britain because one is journalists are so pliant. You see, they over the years they became so familiar with the whole story of Brexit that they could spiel off every few seconds endlessly about the details of Brexit. There was a guy called James O'Brien, he was quite entertaining on the radio, LBC. He kept telling everybody off because he knew so much about Brexit that literally, he could run rings around people in the arguments. And so, he made a lot of people look foolish when they phoned him up and said, Brexit means this, there are too many foreigners, or blah, blah, blah. Now, when it comes to COVID-19, well, this is a new phenomenon for most of the journalists. They haven't bothered to study it. They generally only go into the detail of something a bit late. They're already consumed with other subject matters and so on. The consequence of that is they didn't get on top of it. And therefore they more towed the government line, also because they felt there was social pressure for them to sort of unite together against this virus. And as I said, the consequence is there to see. It's estimated, according to the Financial Times, that the real figures are around 50,000 dead in Britain. Officially nearly 30,000. It will pass 30,000 today. Well, just on the official figures, that's barbaric. And yesterday in the BBC, or late last night on the BBC website, they started talking about the death toll. Well, we shouldn't make international comparisons, they say. For ages we were told the Chinese are lying, the Chinese are lying, the Chinese stats aren't true. And I looked through the SAGE documents that were released yesterday, the government advisory panel, and in the SAGE documents it was clear that the British government had been misinformed, that the Chinese in Wuhan and Hubei had been underestimating or underreporting the figures by about a factor of 10. And Chris Whitty, the Chief Medical Officer for England, claimed at the Health and Social Care Committee on the 5th of March that the Chinese figures were underestimated by a factor of 20. And I think it was partly on the basis of these false statistics or false guesses. I don't know where they came from. It's almost like they came from Steve Bannon or people like that. That the British figures should be calculated on the same type of basis. And that's how we got to the idea that you would have a much larger dissemination in the population than was expected or was already defined. And I think they've also expected now, even till today, they've expected that the actual infection rate has been higher than, or a lot higher than their statistics, although that's probably true because their statistics have only measured a small number of people. So most of the people who caught, just to end the show now because we're reaching 30 minutes, most of the people infected in Britain were infected, since the lockdown, were infected inside hospitals. And that's what we mentioned with Steve earlier on. The hospitals became forcing centres for distributing the virus. A couple of very simple points, just practical points. I've been very carefully following the virology campaign in Germany, and I must say this: it's what's clearly differentiating Germany from Britain, and that's why I think the numbers are so much lower in Germany than they are here as well, is not only the contact tracing and tracking and the testing processes, which are superior to here and much more widely available, and therefore allow people a sense of knowledge about where they are with the disease and therefore what actions they should take that are appropriate to prevent its further spread. But they also had a campaign to inform the public. So there'll be the Robert Koch Institute, there'll be Heinrich Streeck, the lead virologist in Germany from Bonn University, There'll be Christian Drosten from the Charité in Berlin. There'll be Alexander Kekulé from Halle University. And they have radio shows, television shows, YouTube broadcasts that hundreds of thousands of people watch that inform them about the realities of the virus. So one of the most important things, in my opinion, that they found was, well, quite early on they clearly stated that what's called formite transmission, that is transmission from objects, inanimate objects, cardboard, paper, so on, plastics, objects in shops and so on, were not likely to be a major route of infection. Because in real life circumstances, rather than laboratory conditions, the virus does not live on these objects for very long. And they found in the study in Gangelt in Heinsberg, which is a relatively large-scale study, about 1,000 people involved in it, who were infected at one time or another, and they found that that none of the viruses on objects could be cultivated into a living virus, so it wouldn't actually be able to kill you or infect you. So that was quite an important discovery, I thought, and yet that's obviously in a clinical environment or in some environments it is possible. For example, if I cough now and I put my hand on the tree and someone almost immediately touches the tree and puts it to their mouth and breathes in, then in theory they could get infected by mucus from my lungs onto here that were infected if I was infected. But in reality, what's the chances of someone doing that? They're pretty slim. Now in a building, it's a different thing. That's an environmental question. I'll come on to these environmental questions in another show. I've been looking in particular at the Diamond Princess and so on, and it'll be worthwhile examining the various hierarchy of dangers that exist around us so that we can navigate properly and identify what is a safe thing to do and what isn't a safe thing to do. And I think that's important, but I think that merits a different show. And I'll try to get interviews perhaps with some virologists in the next few weeks so we can discuss these type of questions and people can make their own point of opinion. So that's the Speaker's Corner show for this week. Visit our website, speakerscorner.net. I will be discussing with Steve Barnes about how to try and restart Speaker's Corner at some sort of minimal level, probably with some distancing and so on, all these kind of peculiarities. But there's no real reason why we shouldn't have some speaking taking place, and I think Speaker's Corner could become an important indicator of how we overcome these issues in a very practical sense, to be able to express our opinion, to be able to, if you like, in inverted commas, try to get back to some sort of normality where people can express their opinions, combine together, organize together, and try to bring about change. Now, how we will do that in these circumstances, we'll investigate and try out perhaps a few times over the next few weeks, without the intention, of course, of trying to, in my opinion anyway, of trying to break the rules, but rather trying to find a way out, you know. At the very beginning of this crisis, I looked up a film I've seen before. It's a recommendation for the day, and it's a Robert Bresson film, and it's called A Man Escaped. It's about a man attempting to escape from a prison in France under Nazi occupation. And one way, another way he tries, and eventually he finds a way out. But that effectively is the type of dilemma, is a parallel to the dilemma we have today. A beautiful day in Speaker's Corner, Hyde Park. See you sometime at Speaker's Corner soon. I will be announcing any events that we do have, either online or in real life. And the Speaker's Corner show is back on the air now, discussing the type of issues that I've touched upon during this show. Visit our website, speakerscorner.net. Tune in, same time, same place, 104.4 Resonance FM in London, or on digital in Greater London. Or on the website, you can catch the live streams at any time.